The map was an impossibility. Professor Adrian Leclerc knew this the moment his eyes fell upon the brittle parchment spread across a mahogany desk in a forgotten wing of the Constantinides estate library. It shouldn't exist. The Minoan civilization had left no known cartographic record of such precision, certainly nothing that could chart an expanse of sea with coordinates that hinted at land where the modern world saw only endless blue. Adrian's hands hovered above the surface, resisting the urge to touch. He had been invited here for a mundane lecture on Bronze Age pottery, not to rifle through a deceased collector's archive. But the librarian, an elderly Greek woman with trembling fingers, had whispered his name and led him to this hidden room with a conspiratorial glance. "You study Minoans," she had said, "then you should see this." The ink, though faded, still held a richness that suggested mineral pigments and painstaking craftsmanship. Stylized dolphins danced along the edges, their tails curling into delicate spirals. Yet within those spirals, barely discernible, were etched fine lines intersecting in a way that sent a ripple through his academic certainty. The pattern was no accident. It was a code, a guide. Adrian's mind rebelled. For decades he had scoffed at colleagues and amateurs who clung to legends of a sunken city, some fantastical Atlantis grafted onto Minoan history. He had built his reputation on dismantling such theories with ruthless precision, delighting in televised debates where he dismantled fringe academics with a raised brow and a cutting remark. And yet here he was, pulse quickening, afraid to even breathe too heavily over the relic. He traced the coastline with his gaze. The islands were not in their current form, they were more connected, suggesting a time before earthquakes and waves reshaped the Aegean. At the map's center, far from Crete, a faint symbol like an eye stared back at him. It marked open water. "You found something," the librarian said, her voice almost a challenge. He straightened, masking his thoughts behind the same cool detachment that had carried him through academic politics. "It's a forgery," he said, but the words rang hollow even to him. He remembered the feel of the paper under his gloved fingers. It was not modern parchment, but the fibrous texture of something older, something impossibly preserved. As the light from the high windows dimmed, Adrian's mind betrayed him with an image he could not shake, the face of Dr. Eleni Pavlakis, a researcher he had publicly humiliated 5 years ago. She had stood before the archaeological conference in Athens and proposed that a Minoan outpost, an entire city, had been swallowed by the sea around 1500 BCE. He had laughed. "You've been reading myths, not history," he had told her, and the room had joined in his dismissal. Now, with the map spread before him, he felt the weight of that moment like a stone in his chest. If Eleni had been right, if this map confirmed her theory, what did that make him? The librarian's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction, as though she could read his hesitation. "It was not meant to be hidden forever," she murmured. Adrian closed the map gently, each fold deliberate, as if by controlling the motion he could control the avalanche of doubt rising in him. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It came with the estate," she replied. "No record, no explanation, just waiting." He left the library under a lowering sky. The map's image burned into his memory. He told himself he wouldn't return, that it was an oddity not worth his time. But the truth was already lodged in his mind like a splinter, small, unseen, and impossible to ignore. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Adrian Leclerc's life. The first raindrops fell as he reached his car, cold against his skin. Somewhere in the recesses of his mind, a legend he had dismissed was beginning to stir, demanding to be heard. 5 years earlier, the grand lecture hall in Athens had been brimming with anticipation. Every seat was taken, the air thick with the warm scent of paper programs and the faint tang of polished marble. Cameras lined the back wall, ready to capture the annual International Archaeological Symposium. On stage, Dr. Eleni Pavlakis adjusted the microphone, her eyes sweeping the crowd before she began. She was younger then, barely into her 30s, but already carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from years in the field. The Minoans were master seafarers, she began, her voice steady. But there is evidence, geological, mythological, and now cartographic, that suggests they established a major urban centre far beyond Crete, a city that... Adrian Leclerc had been in the front row, his chin propped on his hand, waiting for the inevitable descent into fantasy. As she described submerged ruins glimpsed by divers, patterns in coastal erosion, and oral histories from fishing villages, his smirk grew. When she projected a rough map with a circle drawn over a patch of open sea, he saw his moment. During the Q&A, his hand was the first to rise. "Dr. Pavlakis," he said into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but myths are not maps, and speculation, especially unsupported by concrete evidence, belongs in folklore, not in academic discourse." Laughter rippled through the audience. She met his gaze without flinching. "Sometimes, Professor, the absence of evidence is a challenge to look harder." Not a reason to stop looking. But the damage was done. The panel moved on, and by the time the symposium ended, whispers of Atlantis chaser followed her in the corridors. Adrian had felt a thrill of victory then, convinced he'd defended the sanctity of scholarship. Now, years later, the memory returned with a sharp edge. He sat at his desk, the Minoan map's image replaying in his mind like an accusation. He pulled up the archived video of that conference, watching his younger self lean into the microphone, smug and certain. Then he replayed her answer, calm, measured, and unwilling to retreat. That night, unable to sleep, Adrian found himself sifting through his old research files. He had scoffed at her sources before, but now he studied them with fresh eyes. Geological surveys of the southern Aegean, unexplained anomalies on sonar scans, oral traditions from islands barely marked on modern maps. How much had he missed simply because he hadn't wanted to see? The more he read, the more the pieces aligned, not into a full picture, but into something that made his earlier certainty feel brittle. He pored over maritime records, noting a handful of 19th century explorers who had sketched strange formations beneath the waves, only to have their reports quietly shelved. By dawn, his office was littered with open books and scattered notes. The Minoan map was still locked in his mind, its faint spiral patterns and hidden lines taunting him. There was a growing itch he couldn't ignore. If the coordinates were real, if they matched even loosely to the anomalies in these old surveys, then Eleni's myth might have been the closest thing to truth in that entire conference. For the first time in his career, Adrian felt the creeping shame of realizing he might have been wrong, not just academically, but morally. The map sat on his desk now, a silent intruder in the ordered chaos of Adrian Leclerc's study. He had returned to the Constantinides estate under the pretense of cataloguing pottery fragments, but the librarian had known exactly why he was there. She'd handed him the brittle parchment without a word, as though she were passing on a burden rather than a treasure. Tonight, with the curtains drawn and the city's hum muffled, Adrian worked under the amber glow of his desk lamp. He traced the intricate border designs with a magnifying glass, following the curling tails of dolphins, the sinuous lines of waves. At first glance, they were simply decorative, a flourish worthy of a master artisan. But under magnification, those curves fractured into a network of lines and dots, almost imperceptible. He began to sketch them onto tracing paper, line by painstaking line. Soon a crude grid emerged, each intersection marked with faint symbols. Most were abstract, triangles, circles, chevrons. But one symbol repeated with subtle variation. A spiral, slightly elongated, always pointing toward the same section of open sea. Leaning back, Adrian stared at the shape. His mind flicked to the ancient Minoan depictions of the labyrinth, the sacred spiral associated with both the sea and rebirth. But this spiral was different. It had a vector, a direction, a coordinate. On impulse, he pulled a modern nautical chart from the shelf and overlaid his tracing. The spirals aligned disturbingly well with a spot south of Santorini, far from any recognized landmass. His breath caught. The location was remote, the seafloor depth extreme. Yet, he recalled the faint anomalies in those 19th century divelogues. A sound from the street made him stiffen. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, passed beneath his window. His rational mind dismissed it as a passerby, but the hairs along his arms stood on end. He thought of Eleni's words from years ago. Sometimes, but the absence of evidence is a challenge to look harder. Adrian returned to the map, studying its every imperfection. The paper was weathered, yet resilient, the pigments still clinging to their faded hues. If it was a forgery, it was the most convincing one he had ever seen, and whoever had made it possessed a knowledge no modern hoaxer could conjure. He began typing notes into his encrypted research file, cataloguing every detail, every hypothesis. The work consumed him. Hours slipped away unnoticed until the clock struck 2. His eyes burned, but his mind raced. This was no accident. The map was meant to hide something in plain sight, its true purpose visible only to those willing to look beyond artistry into the language of the sea. Adrian leaned forward, his fingertips brushing the edge of the parchment. In that moment, he knew he could no longer pretend indifference. Whether the world accepted it or not, he would follow the spiral. Outside, the footsteps returned, then stopped. The first sign that someone was watching came 2 days later, in the form of an innocuous email. It was from a Dr. J. Constantine congratulating Adrian on his recent lecture in Marseille. The problem was Adrian hadn't lectured in Marseille, or anywhere, since the previous winter. He ignored it at first, chalking it up to a mistaken identity, but then a second message arrived. This one contained a single line. Some cities are meant to remain buried. No greeting, no signature, no explanation. That same afternoon he noticed a man in a grey coat leaning against a lamp-post across from the university gates. The figure didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched as Adrian crossed the quad. By the time he turned for a second look, the man was gone. He tried to dismiss it. Rival academics could be territorial, especially over sensational claims, and perhaps this was some petty intimidation meant to scare him off. But the tension in his shoulders lingered as he walked to his office. On his desk, a thick envelope waited. Inside was a photocopy of his university contract, certain lines underlined in red ink, the clauses about reputation, funding, and the pursuit of responsible research. That night, Adrian poured himself a whiskey and stared at the Minoan map, now sealed in an archival sleeve. The coordinates burned in his mind. The spiral called to him like a whispered dare. But the more he contemplated following it, the more he sensed that forces beyond academic politics were invested in keeping this city hidden. He thought of the names in the old dive logs, explorers whose discoveries had never seen the light of publication. Some had left the field abruptly, others had vanished entirely from the historical record. Suppressing inconvenient truths was nothing new, but there was a precision here, a chilling efficiency. The next morning, his suspicions were confirmed. In the faculty lounge, a fellow professor, Dr. Miles Hargreaves, cornered him. "Adrian, old friend," Miles said, lowering his voice, "you've been asking around about submerged Minoan structures." His tone was light, but the glint in his eyes was not. "Word of advice? Let it go. Some research is worth less than the trouble it brings." Adrian feigned amusement. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, but inside the warning only solidified his resolve. He had spent his career dismantling what he saw as myths. Now, confronted with the possibility that one of those myths was real and deliberately buried, he felt a fire he hadn't known in years. That evening, he began assembling a crew. Not a public team, but a handful of trusted colleagues and field experts who wouldn't ask too many questions. A marine engineer he'd worked with on a shipwreck survey in Cyprus, a deep-sea diver who owed him a favor, and a graduate student with a knack for data encryption. He left Eleni Pavlakis off the list for now, uncertain whether she would see this as vindication or insult. Each person received only the information they needed. No mention of the map's origin, no details about the interference he'd encountered, just a date, a location, and the assurance that their skills would be put to historic use. But as he sent the last message, Adrian's laptop screen flickered. A new email appeared without any alert sound, as if it had bypassed the usual security. It contained a single image, the Minoan spiral. Beneath it, 3 words in bold black text: "Do not descend." The research vessel Aegean Star cut through the dark waters like a silver blade, its bow rising and falling in the restless swells. Adrian stood on deck, the salty wind stinging his cheeks, the Minoan map folded safely in the waterproof case, strapped to his chest. They had left the port under cover of night, no fanfare, no announcement. Every member of the small crew knew only fragments of the mission's purpose. The marine engineer, Costas, busied himself with calibrating the sonar equipment, muttering about depth readings and temperature gradients. Isla, the diver, checked her tanks with ritual precision, her movements economical and deliberate. And Nikos, the young graduate student, sat at the navigation console, eyes darting between the GPS readout and the hand-drawn coordinates Adrian had given him. The spot lay far from regular shipping lanes, a patch of ocean that official charts labeled simply unremarkable deep. But as dawn broke and the first sonar sweeps came in, Costas frowned. "There's something down there," he said, pointing at a faint outline on the screen. "Too symmetrical to be natural." Adrian leaned in. Even blurred by layers of silt, the shapes were unmistakable, rectilinear lines, intersecting streets, what could only be the shadow of walls and columns. His heart thudded against his ribs. For years he had called this impossible. Now it was materializing before his eyes. They lowered a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, into the water, its lights piercing the gloom as it descended. The camera feed flickered, then stabilized to reveal massive stone blocks stacked with geometric precision. Carvings emerged, spirals, dolphins, and bull motifs worn by centuries but still visible. "By the gods!" Isla whispered, watching the monitor. But just as the ROV neared what appeared to be the entrance to a grand building, the feed went black. Static hissed through the speakers. Costas tapped at the controls. It's not mechanical failure. Something's jamming the signal. Adrian's jaw tightened. He thought of the emails, the figure in the grey coat, the photocopied contract. Whoever didn't want this city found might have anticipated his move. "We're going down ourselves," he said, surprising even himself with the decisiveness in his voice. Isla's brow furrowed. "At this depth, we'll have 10, maybe 15 minutes of safe bottom time. That's all we'll need." Minutes later, the dive team descended into the Aegean's cold embrace. The water grew darker, heavier, until the city rose out of the murk like a dream solidifying. Colonnades reaching toward a surface they would never touch again, plazas littered with amphorae, and mosaics glinting faintly in the ROV's abandoned light beam. Adrian's breath echoed in his mask, each exhale a reminder that time was slipping away. He reached out, brushing the edge of a carved stone. It was the spiral, elongated, directional, just as on the map. A shadow passed above them, not a fish, not a natural shape. Isla glanced up sharply, her eyes wide behind the mask. Something was there. At first, Adrian thought the shadow was a trick of the shifting light, but as it moved again, slow and deliberate, a cold weight settled in his chest. Isla pointed upward, her gloved finger trembling slightly. Through the dim veil of seawater, a dark form hovered, too angular, too purposeful to be anything living. It was a submersible, not theirs. Adrian's pulse hammered in his ears. He tapped Isla's shoulder and signaled for her to keep close. The other craft drifted above them like a silent predator, its lights conspicuously off. For a moment, it lingered as though taking in their presence, then turned sharply, vanishing into the gloom. They didn't have time to dwell on it. The city spread before them, vast and eerily intact. Towering marble columns lined a central avenue paved with massive stone slabs. Barnacle-encrusted statues stood watch, figures of gods and bulls, their features softened by centuries underwater. Adrian swam toward the largest structure, an imposing edifice whose triangular pediment bore a faded yet unmistakable Minoan fresco. Inside, the light from their torches swept across a chamber that seemed frozen in time. Rows of amphorae stood upright, sealed with wax long dissolved but their shapes undisturbed. A low dais at the far end held a stone chest, its surface carved with interlocking spirals. Adrian's breath quickened as he reached out to touch it. His fingers traced the grooves. The spirals were not mere decoration. They matched the coded markings on the map exactly. Heart pounding, he tried to pry the lid open, but centuries of sediment and calcification resisted. Isla joined him, her hands gripping the edges. With a grunt, the seal gave way and the chest shifted. Inside lay a set of bronze tablets. Their surfaces green with corrosion, but the inscriptions still legible in the torchlight. Adrian's mind reeled. These could rewrite everything the world knew about Minoan navigation, trade, even governance. Then a sudden vibration shuddered through the floor. Dust and fragments of shell drifted upward. From outside, a deep metallic thud reverberated, followed by another. Isla's eyes met his in alarm. Through the broken doorway, a beam of light sliced into the chamber. The submersible had returned, and this time its lights were on, glaring and blinding. A figure in a black dive suit emerged from the glow, flanked by two others. They moved with unnerving purpose, swimming straight toward the chest. Adrian instinctively placed himself between the intruders and the find. The lead diver pointed at the tablets, then made a slicing motion across his throat. Clear, universal, leave them. For a suspended moment no one moved. The spirals on the chest seemed to pulse in the torchlight, as if urging him to act. Adrian's lungs burned as he stared down the lead diver, the weight of the ocean pressing in from all sides. Isla hovered just behind him, her hand tightening on his shoulder as if to warn him. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and dangerously low on bottom time. The intruders moved closer, their dark suits blending with the shadows. One of them reached for the chest. Adrian reacted without thinking. He kicked forward, knocking the diver's arm aside. The movement stirred a cloud of silt, reducing visibility to a swirling haze. In the confusion, he slid one of the bronze tablets into the pouch at his waist. It was heavier than expected, almost pulling him downward. He felt Isla's hand urging him toward the exit, but the beam of the intruder's lights swept through the murk, finding them again. A sharp clink echoed as a metal object struck the chamber wall. A spear gun? No, the sound was followed by a thin rope line shooting past him. The lead diver had fired a grappling tool toward the chest, pulling it toward the doorway. Adrian's heart pounded. If they took the chest, the rest of the evidence would vanish into whatever vault or trench these people worked for. He hesitated. Save the chest, or save the single tablet he'd hidden. Isla made the decision for him. She grabbed his arm, forcing him toward the open avenue. A glance at her dive computer confirmed they had less than 4 minutes before the decompression window closed. Reluctantly, he let the chest fade into the swirling gloom behind them. They swam hard, weaving through toppled columns and broken archways, the city's grandeur flashing past in fragments. As they ascended, the water around them brightened. Above, the Aegean star loomed, her ladder swaying with the waves. The moment Adrian's head broke the surface, Costas was there, hauling him aboard. "What happened?" he demanded, eyes darting to Isla, who climbed up moments later. Adrian pulled off his mask, gasping. "We weren't alone," he said simply, and handed Costas the dripping bronze tablet. They were still catching their breath when a low rumble vibrated through the hull. Nikos shouted from the navigation console, "We've got a vessel approaching, fast!" On the horizon, a sleek black ship cut toward them, its silhouette sharp against the afternoon sun. Adrian felt the same chill he'd known in his office weeks earlier, reading those 3 words, "Do not descend." By the time the black ship closed half the distance, Adrian had made his choice. "Set a course for Naxos," he told Costas. "We'll make land before they can intercept." But even as the Aegean star surged forward, he knew this was only the beginning. The tablet in his possession was enough to prove the city's existence, but revealing it would come at a cost he couldn't yet measure. 3 months later, the world knew the truth. The bronze tablet, cleaned, stabilized and translated, had become the centerpiece of an international press conference in Athens. Etched across its surface was a detailed account of a Minoan outpost called Kallipetra, described as a thriving port city that vanished beneath the angry god's hand after a series of violent quakes. The inscriptions confirmed its location almost exactly where the spiral on the map had led Adrian. When the evidence went public, the storm was immediate. Some scholars hailed it as the greatest Aegean discovery in a century. Others accused Adrian of fabrication and theft. The shadowy group that had confronted him underwater never revealed themselves, but whispers circulated of private collectors, corporate interests, and even political factions, with reasons to keep Kallipetra lost. Adrian weathered the backlash with an uncharacteristic calm. The tablet's authenticity was undeniable, and once independent dives confirmed the city's ruins, even his fiercest critics fell silent. The chest, of course, was gone, spirited away that day beneath the waves. Adrian suspected it now sat in some guarded vault, its spirals hidden from the world. But the single tablet was enough. It had not only vindicated him, it had vindicated Eleni Pavlakis. She was at the press conference too. When the cameras were gone and the hall had emptied, she approached him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "It's not often a man admits he was wrong," she said. Adrian shook his head. "It's not enough to admit it," he replied. "I needed to help prove you were right." In the weeks that followed, the Greek government declared the site a protected cultural heritage zone. Plans for careful excavation were underway. Adrian returned to the ruins under official sanction, this time with Eleni at his side, both of them watching as divers surfaced with amphorae, mosaics, and fragments of frescoes that hadn't seen the sun in 3,000 years. On the deck of the Aegean star, Adrian stood alone for a moment, gazing at the blue expanse where Kallipetra slept. The arrogance that had once defined him felt like a distant echo. He had built his career on tearing down what he called myths, yet here he was, humbled by one that had proven itself in stone, bronze, and salt water. He realized the true lesson wasn't just that the city existed. It was that truth doesn't care for the boundaries scholars draw around it, and sometimes the voices we dismiss are the ones that hold the key. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Adrian let the Aegean wind wash over him, carrying away the last of his certainty. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.